Welcome back. As you all know, in the last session we were talking about life in the late 19th century and how it was unspecialized and people did virtually everything for themselves. They didn't depend on any other people, let alone any other regions, when it comes to their day-to-day survival. What I want to talk about in this next section is the culture, the values, and the norms of the late 19th century. Now, if there was one thing that late 19th century Americans really believed in, it was the doctrine of individualism, and you need to write that down. As you can see, that's a key term for this lecture, but it's also an ideology that's going to define life in America well into the 20th century. Now, what Americans thought of when they said individualism was what we would call personal accountability, personal responsibility. In other words, there was nobody that was going to wake you up in the morning for work. That was something that you had to do on your own. There was nobody that was going to stand over your shoulder and tell you what needed to be done and how to do it. That was something that you were going to have to do on your own. So, to the late 19th century American, individualism was a way of gauging how well somebody was living their life, how good of a person they were, how much that they were worth, so to speak. And the reason that most Americans believed in the doctrine of individualism was because they felt that that's what made America great. It was America's great pioneering spirit, the idea that we didn't have an intrusive government that was standing over us at every turn of events and telling us how to do something or when to do something or various ways of doing things. It gave rise to innovation, good inventions that made American life better. It allowed Americans that had been born into humble origins to get rich. You can think of somebody like a Henry Ford, for instance. I mean, Ford really wasn't a rich man when he developed the idea of the horseless carriage. He didn't invent it, but you understand what I mean. He was just the farm kid that tinkered. Well, you know, what a lot of people meant was you are free as an individual to pursue your talents as high as you can go with them. Individualism for most Americans is what made America great. That there was a cost with this in that you were responsible for your own lot in life, but the great benefit was there were very few obstacles that could prevent you from quote-unquote making it. Now, part of the reason that most Americans believed so strongly in individualism is because they also believed in something called the equality of opportunity. Another one of your terms. Now, for your notes, the equality of opportunity meant that we were going to remove, as a society, we were going to remove all of those obstacles that got in everyone's way when it comes to making it, when it comes to getting rich. And what I mean by that is we were going to remove requirements for people who wanted to be doctors or teachers. As I noted in the last session, the guy that you called doctor probably didn't go to medical school, probably didn't have a residency or anything like that, and certainly wasn't board certified. But Americans in the late 19th century believed that that was a good thing because the American Association of Medicine couldn't block anybody from becoming a doctor. If you're good at what you did, then you could do it, and nobody could tell you that you couldn't. Furthermore, Americans believed in the equality of opportunity because they said if you eliminated any restrictions when it comes to men and their ability to vote, we could vote in politicians that would pass favorable laws and therefore make it easier for people to pursue their talents. What I'd like you to write down next to equality of opportunity is on paper, everybody's equal. In other words, we're all starting out from the same point, and where we go from there is ultimately up to us. It gets back into individualism. The ball is in your court. You can go as high as you want to, but you have to work for it. Now, I'm assuming many of you are probably looking at this concept a little bit skeptical, because as you know, there are clearly things that get in the way of making it. And I mean people that are really good individuals, really talented, really hard-working individuals. You see it every day. Racism, sexism, class bias, ethnic prejudice. I could go on and on and on forever, but you get the idea. So you need to understand that even though we were talking a really good game in terms of the equality of opportunity and everybody's starting at the same point and be a good individual and you'll have material wealth in your life, you have to understand that that really wasn't the case. It wasn't the case any more then than it is now. America was a segmented society in the late 19th century. And what I mean by that is we were segmented along gender lines and along racial lines, and that's worth writing down. What that means is the equality of opportunity was really only afforded to white men, and I probably should also add native-born, English-speaking white men. Let me give you one example. There was a concept, an ideology really, that had been born out of the earlier part of the 19th century called the cult of true womanhood. Again, another term that you should be familiar with at the end of this lecture. The cult of true womanhood emphasized that woman's natural place was in the home. It was keeping the home, it was raising children, and it was guarding the family's gentler virtues from the outside world. Well, if woman's place is in the home, that implies that man's place was out there in the world, in the public sphere, out there making the money, and consequently making a lot of the decisions, including political decisions. Now, whatever your personal feelings are with respect to where women should or should not be, or should that even be a conversation in the first place, I'm hopeful that you can see that this limits everyone's ability to make it. We're talking about a time here that women were not allowed to apply to places like Harvard or Yale or any place like that. Women weren't supposed to be employed in private industry. We're talking about a time where women were not supposed to be seen giving a public lecture, giving a public talk. So obviously, if this is the expectation that your place is in the home, obviously not everybody is equal, and not everybody has an opportunity to rise as high as their talents will take them. We're talking about a sexist society, but nobody really bothered to really delve into this. I mean, obviously there were feminists, people like Susan B. Anthony, that clearly had a problem with this, but generally speaking, this was an accepted norm, and it'll continue to be an accepted norm well into the 20th century. Now, I've mentioned that this was a segmented society along gender lines. It's also segmented along racial lines. Again, the equality of opportunity applied to white men only. And once again, generally speaking, you're talking about native-born, English-speaking white men. Example. In 1896, there was a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. A man by the name of Homer Plessy, Plesse, sued a train company because they made him sit in the African American section of the train. Homer Plessy said, my skin might be black, but my money is green and it spends just the same as everybody else's money, therefore I ought to be able to sit in any open seat on the train. Well, this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, as long as the accommodations, in other words, the train cars, are the same, the train company was legally authorized to segregate however they wanted to segregate. They could segregate white from black, they could segregate old from young, rich from poor. You get the idea. So my point with this is in 1896, segregation basically got the blessing of the highest court in the land. And what you see thereafter, not to say that it hadn't existed before that, what you generally see is two separate worlds, one for black and one for white. And although the law, the spirit of the law anyway, emphasized the equality of conditions, we can all agree that the black school was always inferior to the white school. Blacks were seated at the back of the bus later on when busing became a reality, to reinforce the idea that black was supposed to be subordinate to white. So the conditions were rarely, if ever, what we would consider equal. So as you can see, I'm hopeful that you can see this by now, the equality of opportunity was really hypocritical. You're talking about a very select group of Americans when it comes to, on paper, everyone has the same opportunity. And we'll complicate this issue a little bit later in our class when we talk about the rise of industrial capitalism. But for right now, what I want to emphasize to you is everyone's goal in life, white, black, rich, poor, native-born, foreign-born, everyone's goal in life was to be really, really, really productive. Remember, individualism emphasized the idea that you should be really, really, really productive. Now, obviously, when you have this outlook on life, when your lot in life is to get up, keep your nose to the grindstone, quit 5 minutes after the quitting bell rings, and then get up the next morning and do it all again, obviously you're setting yourself up for a really, really dynamic economy. And that's what I'd like you to understand about the economy in the late 19th century. It does backflips. It booms in the late 19th century. Now, these small-town, keep-your-nose-to-the-grindstone, tough work ethics, that was a big part of it, but you also need to understand there's a lot more to it than that. We get a lot more people in the late 19th century. And what I mean is Americans start having more babies, and because there's more food and there's more consumer items to go around, a lot of those babies are surviving into adulthood. And not only are Americans having more babies, but you're having more people from other countries come to America. People from China, people from Ireland, later on people from Eastern Europe, people from parts of Latin America. And so generally speaking, what you have is a population boom. And anytime you have more hands, what you have is an opportunity to be more productive. You don't have to be an economist to understand that concept. You also see land expansion. We'll talk about this when we talk about the development of the American West, but from the end of the Civil War, really during the Civil War forward, what you see is America taking in more and more and more and more land. Places like the Heartland, Kansas, Nebraska, various parts of Texas are populated. The American government gives away free land. Those people run out there that have free land, and what they do is they farm on it. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the semester. Now, you've got more people on more land, and the other thing that I want you to understand is you've also got better ways of getting around. We're a really big country, and it's difficult to get from coast to coast. Well, in 1869, all of that changed. In 1869, we completed what came to be known as the Transcontinental Railroad. It started in Chicago, and it ran all the way west to San Francisco. And now, not only could you get all that good stuff, like citrus fruits and almonds and wines that they make in California back and forth, you could also get people back and forth. What historians call this is the transportation revolution. It was easier to get products and people from point A to point B. And any time you have a revolution, you make it quicker to get around, it's much more productive. So the transportation revolution was, just like everything else that I mentioned, part of the ingredient when it comes to why America's economy was booming during this time period. Now, not only are we making it easier to get from point A to point B, we're also getting better trained workers. In 1862, there was a congressman from Pennsylvania. His name was Justin Morrill, M-O-R-R-I-L. And his idea was to take all of the land that some of these states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Texas owned and donate it to learning institutions, institutions of higher education. What it came to be known as was the Morrill Land Grant Act. And really important universities, like my alma mater, for example, Michigan State University, was given all of this state-owned land, and what they did with it is they used it to train future farmers. Agriculture became a science. They used it to train future engineers, future mechanics, future accountants. In short, people that now had a very technical education were versed in the science of growing corn, not just the traditions of agriculture. We're now going out there into the real world, and obviously this made it more productive. So you see institutions like Michigan State or Penn State was another land-grant institution, or closer to home here, Texas A&M or Prairie View A&M, that literally were training the next generation of America's economic leaders. Obviously, this was very conducive to the concept of economic growth. So, in conclusion, what I'd like you to understand is this is a very interesting and dynamic time period in American history. the segmented society in the late 19th century. I need you to understand that although we talked a really good game when it comes to the idea of anybody can make it as long as you're a good individual, there are certain segmented ideas that are walling off the pursuit of happiness, if you will, to certain groups of Americans. But at the same time, this idea, this impulse, this obsession with being a good, dutiful individual and having a good, strong work ethic lent itself very, very well to America's economic development. And that's primarily where we'll pick it up when we begin our next discussion on the rise of industrial capitalism.